There's something uniquely mortifying about walking past your own garden and realizing you've somehow managed to transform living plants into dried husks. I've been there more times than I'd like to admit. My friends joke that I have a gift, not for gardening, but for plant cremation. And for years, that felt painfully accurate. But somewhere between those early failures and where I stand now, something shifted. Not because I suddenly became dedicated or developed some magical green thumb, but because I stopped fighting my own nature, and instead started working with it. I started learning which plants could survive despite my tendency to forget they exist for weeks at a time. Which ones actually prefer my hands-off approach. And honestly, my garden has never looked better. If you're anything like me, if you've ever stood in the plant section of a garden center feeling hopeful, only to watch that hope wither alongside whatever you planted last month, then you're going to want to stick around. Because I've spent the last 2 decades figuring out which perennials don't just tolerate neglect, they actually thrive in it. And I'm about to walk you through all 9 of them. If you're new here at Golden Age Gardening, I cover everything from classic perennials to the plants everyone says are impossible to grow but really aren't. Subscribing takes about 3 seconds, and honestly, your garden will probably thank you for it. So let's get into this. The thing about being a mediocre gardener is that you learn fast which plants are going to make you look foolish, and which ones will make you look like you know what you're doing even when you absolutely do not. Over the past 2 decades of working with my own garden, of planting things, ignoring them, and watching what survives, I've identified 9 perennials that have become the backbone of my entire landscape. These aren't rare specimens that require coddling. These aren't plants that demand your attention or your expertise. These are the plants that show up year after year, producing flowers and foliage regardless of whether I've remembered to water them recently. Let me start with a plant that transformed my approach to shady areas entirely. When I first started gardening, I had this frustrating habit of putting sun-loving plants in partial shade and then acting surprised when they sulked. I wasted money and time doing this repeatedly. Then I discovered Astilbe, and it became the template for everything else I'd eventually plant in those shadowy corners of my property. Plant number 1. Astilbe. Astilbe is one of those plants that feels almost too easy. It grows in shade, real shade. Not that misleading partial shade that actually needs 4 hours of sun. The foliage is delicate and feathery, and when it blooms, you get these tall, plume-like flower spikes that range from deep crimson to pale pink to pure white. The variety I started with was a peachy orange that bloomed in late summer, and it became such a reliable performer that I eventually added 2 more varieties to extend the blooming period. Here's what makes Astilbe so valuable. It thrives in moist soil, which means in most climates, if you get regular rain, you barely need to water it. The blooms last for several weeks, and even after they fade, the dried flower heads look architectural and interesting enough to leave standing. Through fall, I actually keep mine up well into winter for that reason. The foliage dies back completely in cold months, which sounds like a loss. But it's actually a feature. Your shade bed cleans itself. There's no constant pruning or maintenance, it just vanishes. Then comes back stronger the following spring. I've had my original Astilbes now for nearly 17 years, and they've never once given me a single moment of concern. Now if Astilbe occupies my shady spaces, I needed something equally forgiving for areas with more light. This is where I made a decision early on that honestly saved me thousands of dollars in future plant purchases. Plant number 2, daylilies. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I let my daylilies get away from me. I don't divide them. I don't deadhead them nearly as often as horticultural purists insist you should. I basically plant them and then leave them alone for years, and somehow, they've decided to reward this neglect with abundant blooms and vigorous growth. Daylilies are called daylilies because each individual flower lasts only a single day. They bloom sequentially along tall stems, so you get multiple flowers per plant over several weeks. That initial variety I planted was an orange cultivar that flower breeders call tawny daylily, and it takes over an entire section of my garden each midsummer. When the blooms are finished, they're done. They don't require deadheading to keep producing new flowers. That's purely a cosmetic preference. These plants are supposed to love full sun, and mine certainly do in the spots where they get at least 6 hours of direct light. But I also have daylilies thriving in partial shade areas that barely qualify as sunny. They're less floriferous than their sun-drenched cousins, but they still produce consistent blooms. The root systems are so vigorous that water competition barely registers to them. They laugh at drought. And while I know that dividing them every few years is technically best practice, my experience has been that even severely overcrowded patches keep blooming quite happily. What's remarkable is the breeding work on daylilies in the past few decades. There are now varieties that bloom at different times of the year, so you can create succession plantings. The color range has expanded dramatically. You can find daylilies that are nearly black or pale yellow, or bicolor combinations that look almost unnatural. Some varieties are fragrant, which is an unexpected bonus. The reason I keep going back to daylilies is simple. I've never killed one. I've neglected them, crowded them, underwatered them, and they've responded by making my garden look intentional and lush. That's a pretty good return on minimal investment. Moving away from these flashier bloomers, I want to tell you about a plant that was already established in my garden when I arrived at this property. It became one of my most valuable lessons about patience and observation. Plant number 3, Bleeding Heart. When we bought this house 2.5 decades ago, there were already established plantings throughout the property. Some were obviously recent additions, maintained with intention. Others seemed to have been there for years, maybe longer. The bleeding hearts were in that second category. I remember my first spring here, watching these delicate pink and white flowers emerge from nowhere, creating these perfect little heart shapes dangling from arching stems. The thing about bleeding hearts is that they have a very specific life cycle. They bloom in spring, typically April or May depending on your climate, and the flowers are genuinely precious. After the blooms finish, the foliage just melts away. By midsummer, you'd never know they were there. This seems like a problem until you realize it's actually a brilliant feature. You get spring color in a shady spot, and then that area opens up for other plants to shine during summer and fall. The original bleeding hearts in my garden were old when I arrived, and I've done virtually nothing to them. No fertilizer, no special amendments. They get watered when everything else gets watered, which in our region means seasonal rainfall plus occasional supplemental watering during dry spells. They come back every single year without fail, with more flowers than they had the year before. I've since added a few more bleeding heart varieties. There's a lovely white form, and some cultivars have more finely divided foliage. Each one has performed identically, arriving in spring, putting on a beautiful show, disappearing by summer, and then repeating the cycle exactly as planned. One piece of advice I'd offer anyone moving into an established garden: spend a full year observing what's already there before making major changes. I'm genuinely grateful I didn't rip out those bleeding hearts in some fit of garden redesign enthusiasm. They've been one of the most rewarding parts of my landscape, and I'd earned none of the credit for establishing them. After those spring bloomers transition out, I needed something to create visual drama in my garden during late spring and early summer. When the space tends to look a bit bare, that's when vertical elements become crucial, and clematis became my solution to a problem I didn't even fully realize I had. Plant number 4, Clematis. My property came with a chain link fence that was functional but deeply ugly. I spent my first couple of years trying to think of expensive solutions. A wood fence, a privacy screen, something to hide that industrial eyesore. Then I realized I could plant clematis and let the vines do the work for a fraction of the cost. Clematis comes in hundreds of varieties, and they have blooming times that range from spring through late fall. The one I initially planted was a large flowered type that produces showy blooms in late spring to early summer. The flowers are genuinely impressive, 4 to 6 inches across, with thick petals in purple-blue shades. When they're in full bloom, they almost make you forget about the fence entirely. Now, here's where my experience diverges from what the books recommend. Clematis is supposed to be a full sun lover. Mine is planted in a location that gets morning sun and afternoon shade, essentially what most people would call partial shade. It still blooms prolifically, not quite as lavishly as if it had all-day sun, but more than enough to justify its presence. The care requirements are minimal. Clematis vines appreciate soil that doesn't dry out completely, but they don't need the constant moisture that some plants demand. Once established, they vine extensively, covering whatever support you give them. The blooms appear year after year without pruning, though some gardeners do light pruning to maintain shape. I do next to no pruning, and it's fine. What I've learned about clematis is that there's a variety for almost every situation. If you want spring blooms, there are cultivars for that. If you prefer late summer or fall flowers, those exist too. Some are fragrant, which is a nice surprise when you're working nearby. They're perfect for creating vertical interest, on fences, trellises, pergolas, or even on shrubs that have finished blooming for the year. That chain link fence is still standing, by the way. The clematis is so vigorous and so beautiful that I've never bothered to replace it. Why spend the money when the vines have essentially solved the problem for me? Around the same time I was establishing the clematis, I was also thinking about early summer impact in my garden's most prominent location. I wanted something that would create presence, something substantial and beautiful and requiring absolutely zero fuss. Peonies made that decision easy. Plant number 5, peonies. There's a particular quality to peonies that makes them feel like an heirloom plant, even when they're newly purchased. They're substantial. They're long-lived to the point of absurdity. They produce absolutely stunning flowers, and they demand almost nothing in return. I have 3 peony bushes in my garden, and honestly, they're some of my most prized plants. 2 of them are in ideal locations. Full sun, well-draining soil, the whole package. They bloom prolifically in that sweet spot between late spring and early summer, producing these enormous, fluffy flowers in shades of pink and red. The blooms are heavy enough that the stems sometimes flop over, which just means I should stake them better. Do I? Rarely. Do they still look beautiful? Always. The 3rd peony is in a shadier location, shadier than is supposedly ideal, and yet it blooms. Not quite as heavily as its sunnier siblings, but reliably and beautifully nonetheless. What makes peonies exceptional is their longevity. My bushes are old enough that if they were people, they'd be drinking wine at fancy restaurants. They just get better with age. The root systems develop, the stems get thicker, and the floral displays become more impressive. You can literally have peonies that were planted before you were born, in a house that wasn't yours when they were planted, and they'll still come back exactly as expected. Peonies also have interesting foliage throughout the season. It's not showy, but it's attractive and provides structure even after the blooms are finished. In fall, the leaves turn interesting shades of red and purple before dying back completely for winter. One thing I didn't know when I started gardening was that certain peony cultivars are ant gardens. They attract ants that farm aphids on the flower buds. This used to worry me, until I realized the ants don't actually harm the plant, and the blooms open up beautifully regardless. It's a quirky part of the ecosystem, not a problem to solve. Transitioning into midsummer, my garden needed something with presence and color that would dominate the visual landscape for months. That's where hydrangeas proved invaluable. Plant number 6, hydrangea. My front yard is anchored by 3 hydrangea varieties, and they're probably the plants I get the most compliments on. When they're in bloom, they're absolutely spectacular. The flower clusters are enormous, some the size of dinner plates, and they create a visual impact that makes the whole front of the house feel designed and intentional. Hydrangeas come in a few basic types. I have panicle hydrangeas, which produce upright cone-shaped flower clusters that work beautifully in fresh arrangements or dried for winter interest. The other main type is the mophead hydrangea, which produces those big rounded flower clusters. There are also lace-cap varieties, which are more delicate in appearance. The color chemistry of hydrangeas is genuinely interesting. In some varieties, the soil pH affects the bloom color. Acidic soil produces blue flowers, alkaline soil produces pink flowers. Mine happen to be in a region with naturally acidic soil, so I get the blue tones I wanted without any intervention. Other varieties have colors that don't shift based on pH, so if you want specific colors, you need to choose your cultivar carefully. My experience with hydrangeas is that they're genuinely low maintenance if you place them right. Full disclosure, I did kill one hydrangea. I put it in a dark corner of my yard, where almost nothing grows. A spot that gets maybe an hour of weak morning light. Hydrangeas need more light than that. But my other hydrangeas are in locations with partial sun and afternoon shade, and they thrive with minimal water during most of the year. Only during intense summer heat waves do they look a bit stressed, and a good watering fixes that quickly. The blooms appear from midsummer and persist well into fall, sometimes even surviving light frosts. You can deadhead spent flowers to keep them looking fresh, or you can leave them to dry on the bush and enjoy them in that dried state. Both approaches work. I usually do a mix, removing some clusters while leaving others to dry naturally. Moving into the portions of my garden that sit under tree cover or in predominantly shady locations, I needed plants that wouldn't just survive shade, but that would actually showcase shade-loving characteristics. Hostas became my go-to solution. Plant number 7, hostas. Hostas are almost comically easy if you have shade. I know plenty of gardeners who think hostas are boring, and I understand that perspective. They're foliage plants primarily, which means they're not going to give you the floral drama that some plants deliver. But the foliage itself is where the beauty lives. The hosta varieties are astonishingly diverse. There are tiny hostas that barely reach a foot tall. There are enormous specimens that can take up several feet of space. The foliage colors range from deep blue-green to bright gold to combinations with white or cream variegation. The leaf shapes vary from narrow and grass-like to huge heart-shaped forms to ruffled and frilly varieties. The one I've had for nearly 20 years is in a shady spot under a large tree. It's never been divided, never been fertilized, never received any special treatment. It gets watered when everything else gets watered, and it's grown increasingly dense and impressive with each passing season. In late summer, it produces tall stems with small lavender-colored flowers, which is a nice bonus. The flowers aren't showy, but they're charming, and they attract pollinators. What makes hostas so valuable in a low-maintenance garden is that they actually improve your shade. Dense shade can feel dead and empty. Hostas in various colors, sizes, and leaf types can make a shady area feel lush and intentional. You can create combinations that work together, layering different varieties to create depth and visual interest. Hostas do have a pest problem in some regions. Slugs love them. In areas where slugs are severe, this can be frustrating, but in many regions, slug pressure is minimal, and hostas grow without any pest issues whatsoever. The foliage dies back in winter, which is fine. Come spring, it reemerges from the roots exactly as you left it. There's no maintenance required beyond occasionally removing the dead foliage in spring. As I was building out my landscape, I wanted something that would bridge the color gap between late spring and the peak of midsummer bloom, something that would be reliable and visually interesting, and also manageable from a maintenance perspective. Salvias filled that role perfectly. Plant number 8, Salvia. I need to be specific here because there are many plants called sage, and not all of them are the same. The salvias that have become my workhorse plants are the ornamental salvias, specifically cultivars like Salvia nemorosa and related varieties. These are not the culinary sage you'd use in cooking, though they are in the same family. Ornamental salvias are nearly foolproof. I've genuinely never killed one. They start blooming in spring and continue producing flowers through fall. The bloom spikes are slender and delicate, creating a more subtle visual effect than, say, a hydrangea. But that subtlety is actually valuable. The colors I've grown are primarily in the purple and pink range, though there are also white and blue varieties available. What makes salvias so resilient is that they're built for drought. The foliage is aromatic. You can brush against the plants and smell them. That aromatic quality typically indicates the plants have protective mechanisms against pests and diseases. They love full sun and well-draining soil, which is why they thrive in my garden during the hot, dry parts of summer, when everything else is looking stressed. My original salvia has been growing in the same spot for well over a decade. I recently added a pink flowering variety to create more color variation. Both are thriving without fertilizer, without special soil amendments, without anything beyond their initial planting. The bloom time is genuinely valuable because it bridges seasons. As peonies are finishing, salvias are ramping up. As other plants are declining in late summer, salvias are still going strong. Into fall, they keep producing flowers even as temperatures drop. In most climates, they'll survive winter and reemerge in spring, creating reliable perennial color. Finally, I wanted to address the fall and winter landscape. Many gardens look bare and uninteresting once the first frost hits. I needed plants that would provide visual interest during those months when everything else is dormant. Sedum became my solution. Plant number 9. Sedums are succulents, which means their leaves are thick and fleshy, storing water in a way that makes them drought tolerant. But unlike many houseplant sedums, the varieties I'm focusing on are hardy perennials that survive cold winters and come back year after year. The sedum I've been growing for years is a tall variety that produces dusky pink flowers in late summer. As the season progresses and temperatures cool, those flowers deepen in color, becoming almost burgundy by early fall. The foliage also shifts colors as the season changes, taking on purple and red tones. What makes sedums interesting in fall and winter is that you can leave them standing. As the flowers dry on the plant, they develop interesting texture and architectural quality. The seed heads are intricate and beautiful in a way that feels almost intentional. Like garden art, they also provide food for birds and beneficial insects during months when resources are scarce. Sedums require minimal water once established, even less than some of the other plants I've discussed. They prefer well-draining soil and full sun. They're not going to tolerate sitting in water, so if your garden tends to stay wet, sedums might struggle. But in most garden situations, they're reliable and beautiful. I've added a lighter colored sedum variety recently to create more contrast in that part of my garden. Both are thriving without any fuss. Bringing it together. What all 9 of these plants share is a remarkable tolerance for my particular gardening style, which is to say, my neglect. They don't require constant attention. They don't demand perfect soil or ideal conditions. They show up, They perform. They create beauty in my garden. When I look at my garden now, I see something that actually looks intentional, cohesive, and well-maintained. My friends assume I'm out here every weekend, carefully nurturing my plants. The reality is that I probably spend 10 hours a month on maintenance during the growing season. I'm not out here fussing and worrying. I'm out here occasionally watering during dry spells, removing dead growth in spring, and enjoying what these plants produce. If you're struggling to keep plants alive, if you've felt frustrated by repeated failures, if you're tired of guilt every time you pass your garden, these 9 plants might be exactly what you need. They're proof that you don't need to be a dedicated gardener to create something beautiful. If you found this helpful, subscribing to Golden Age Gardening means you'll get more plant recommendations, more honest talk about what works and what doesn't, and more confidence that you can actually create a garden that makes you happy. Leave a comment down below telling me which of these plants you're most excited to try. I read through the comments, and I genuinely love hearing what resonates with you. And if you know someone who thinks they can't grow anything because they've killed too many plants, share this with them. Because the secret isn't some special talent, it's just finding plants that are already designed to work with your habits instead of against them. Thanks for watching.